This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal study scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Every week I talk to you about ASA. Now, have you followed my instructions and taken a look at their Facebook page? There's a lot of things added to the Facebook page regularly. Have you also gone to their website? It's a beautiful website. It features some really, really lovely artworks by animal studies scholars and artists. And finally, have you thought about joining? Membership is very reasonable and starts from $15 a year for unwaged. So that's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This episode is also brought to you by Animal Publics. Animal Publics is a book series. It's part of Sydney University Press. It has loads of really fantastic animal-focused books. The series is edited by Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Melissa Boyd. They do a fantastic job. There are so many lovely books there. Could be good for a Christmas present. Flight of the Birds could be good. Or just simply think about ordering animal studies books for your institution. So that's Animal Publics, part of the University of Sydney Press. Okay, well, let's get down to business. It's kind of a smoky day in Sydney town, not too warm, even though it's summer. And I'm here on campus at the University of Sydney. And I'm really lucky to be joined by a return guest. I'm joined by Dr. Arian Wallach. Did I get that right, Wallach? No. Wallach, who is lecturer in the School of Life Sciences at UTS. And Arian is also a member of the Centre for Compassionate Conservation. And today we're going to discuss her most recent paper, When All Life Counts in Conservation. And it appeared in the journal Conservation Biology. It's about to come out in 2020, or it should just be out perhaps when people are listening to this. And there's a long list of co-authors. So we've got Erick Lundgren, Celeste Batavia, Michael Paul Nelson, Esty Yanco, Wayne L. Linklater, Scott Carroll, Danny, our own Danny, who we're hoping to get on the podcast soon, Kate Brandis, Jamie Steer, Daniel Ramp, who we're also trying to get onto the podcast soon. But with all those authors in mind, the one we have here today is Arian. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Well, welcome back, I should say. Okay, so why this work? What inspired it?
So I've been working as an ecologist in Australia for quite a few years. And some of the creatures that I've been most drawn to get to know are creatures that at this point in time conservationists would rather not know or would rather have them completely gone. I've become very interested in animals like wild cats in Australia, red foxes in Australia, rabbits in Australia, wild donkeys, wild horses, and one of my favorites are wild camels. And over the past few years, I've been noticing that even though there's quite a lot, they draw quite a lot of a particular kind of attention, they're almost completely absent from the most fundamental data that is available to conservation scientists. So when I talk about data, you'd be familiar with, many of your listeners would be familiar with when there are big announcements, for example, about the extinction crisis, right? There's the Extinction Rebellion, and there's And there was an announcement of, an X% of population decline of vertebrates, or 1 million species gone extinct, announcements by the UN, announcements by the WWF. All of these are based on a data set called the Iucn Red List. And the Red List aims to track as many species as it possibly can, find out where they are, how they're doing, what kind of threats are affecting them, and all that kind of information. But a lot of the animals that I like to know are not on the Red List. And they're not on the Red List not because no one's gotten around to it yet, but they are excluded from the data itself because they are not considered native. So the Iucn Red List and all of the science and policy and advocacy that comes out of it is based only on those populations that are considered wild animals. So you won't find a donkey on the Iucn Red List, wild or otherwise. You won't find a camel. You won't find the species, in fact, on the Iucn Red List. You won't find about 900 different populations of European rabbits because they're all considered not to be native and therefore not to count in conservation. And what I wanted to do together with my colleagues, we went through the data and put those creatures back into the Red List, well, that is within our list. We created new maps, we created new threat statuses, we created new lists, and then asked, well, what would the data look like if we included everyone?
Wonderful. Well, my temptation now is to ask you what it would look like. But before I do that, I want to ask you a few other things. Can you tell us a little bit about why native got the special status it did? What is it about being native that makes some animals so special, or what is it about not being native that makes you so kind of irrelevant in conservation terms?
That's a question that I find quite difficult to answer because it's a position that that actually doesn't make sense to me. So it's a position that I kind of have to think through. It's also a position that's relatively new to me. So those of your listeners that are Australian would probably take this idea of nativeness for granted. I'm not originally from Australia, and nativeness wasn't a thing when I grew up. It wasn't a thing when I was a young conservation scientist, when I was doing my undergraduate and my master's. I didn't even encounter these kinds of ideas. But when I came to Australia, it was very, very clearly right in my face that there are species that belong and species they don't. And the best description I have seen for it, it's a critical description, but it's one that I like, is by the journalist and author Emma Maris, who describes what she calls a white dude moment. So there's a moment in many places around the world where a white dude steps off a boat, and the moment he puts his white dude foot on the land, a magical transformation happens. Whatever that was there before he set his foot on the land was nature, wild, so on. And everything that comes after is either tame, civilized, despoiled, depending on what kind of angle you take with it. So if you were there before a white guy, in this case James Cook, whenever James put his foot on land, then that's where you belong. And if you came with or after James and his buddies, then you don't.
Interesting. And in the case of Australia, of course, we fight over which exact white dude put his foot where first, and the French try and get in on the act as well. So it's quite interesting then, because in many ways you're describing your ability to bring a unique or a critical perspective to something that many Australians would take for granted, because you yourself are not native to Australia. So it strikes me reading your paper that vocabulary and language are very important. you use language in very particular ways. So, for example, you talk about migration. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing with language and why that matters?
We grappled for a very long time about how do you talk about these issues without reinforcing the very issues you're trying to talk about? And it is almost impossible. And I'm not convinced that we've even managed to do that. The moment you define something, the moment you create a category, that category can then trip you up. And so all we managed to do was not really get rid of these categories that I and others find so problematic from a range of perspectives, but we softened them a little. And so rather than using terminologies such as introduced, invasive, alien, pest is used, we decided to use the language of migration. We looked at defined species as either immigrants or emigrants, because we were looking at species that were, in this case, vertebrates. We looked specifically at vertebrates, where there's quite a bit of information about, that were introduced into Australia after the white dude moment, based on those categories, and by the same token, species that are considered native to Australia and have been established elsewhere, which is... and even though these categories are problematic, when you do look at these stories, they are really interesting to follow. It's interesting to find out about some little wallaby population in Paris, or about camels in Australia. The stories are, each is more bizarre and interesting than the other, but we wanted to treat them, try and really take a position of them as beings with agency when they establish, try to use the kind of language that we will often use for one another. No one's ever called me an invasive or an alien or a pet. No, I may have been called a pest or a non-native. So we wanted to use language that is more aligned with kind of language we would use with one another.
Wonderful. So I'm sensing that listeners can't contain their excitement any longer. What does happen when we add to the red list animals that were not here, as you say, when that white dude moment took place?
Yeah, animals or plants.
Animals or plants.
Yeah. So it's actually a difficult thing to talk about. It's difficult because numbers have moral weight, and numbers can automatically hold moral weight that we don't necessarily want to assign to them. So let me give you a number. The number is 52. That number could be revised this way or that depending on certain calculations, but let's just stick with this number 52. The number 52 comes from the number of species, of vertebrate species that have gone extinct in Australia, and the number of species that were introduced. So there's 87 that were introduced and 35 that went extinct. We get the number 52, plus 52. That means that since European colonization, Australia's vertebrate species richness has increased by 52. What does that mean? Does that mean, 52 is better, plus 52 is surely better than minus 52? Or, wouldn't it be nicer if we had 62? Or, if we had 42, we'd know the meaning of life as well. So it's a very difficult. You start to pay attention that something as simple as counting stuff, counting someone, counting, categorizing, which we completely take for granted is completely invisible. is very, very tricky and is imbued with ethics, and it's imbued with politics. The other thing that we found is that many of these creatures that have established here that are regarded, many of them are by law declared pests, are threatened in their native ranges. One example, perhaps one of the most striking example, is the wild camel that doesn't even exist in the wild anymore in the area where it's considered native, which is Levant, North Africa. The wild camel went extinct about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And now there's somewhere in the order of 300,000 to 500,000 wild camels in Australia. It's like a miracle. And there's quite a few species for whom Australia provides a lifeline for that kind that we've defined that as a species, including the European rabbit, which is considered, they breed like rabbits, and so they're rabbits. But very few people know that rabbits are near threatened in their native range. They're not actually considered native to Britain. They're considered native to the Iberian Peninsula, and there's a lot of conservation efforts to try and protect them. And yet here we are trying to eradicate them here.
Yeah, it's funny old business, isn't it? I think it's the same with deer. I think the deer in Royal National Park are in the same situation. So we've decided that context matters terribly in these cases. Yeah. So I guess that leads me to the next question, which is that you're a conservation biologist, and you have published this paper with many co-authors in the journal Conservation Biology. How has it been received by the wider academic conservation community?
Well, it's just recently been published, and it's available online as an accepted version, not yet fully published. But we did publish an article about it when it came on air in The Conversation. Some may be familiar, but it's a place where academics can write about their research. It's hard to know. It's a difficult subject, and it's certainly controversial. Some of the responses that we got were very, very negative. Although there's also, I think, a bit of a tendency generally in social engagement and online engagement for negative, even aggressive ways of debating subjects to be quite normalized, and to what extent that actually represents people's ability to think through things, or generally what people think. I don't know. I would say that all I can say is from what I've encountered. I've encountered quite a mixed bag. Everything from curiosity, which is what do we do with it? Generating questions, which is really what we hope to do. To anger, that this is that really what we're doing is reducing the value of all of these species that conservation scientists are working so hard to protect. And if we include these animals like wild cats or brumbies or cane toads, God forbid, in our data, then we're just going to completely let go of all of these other endemic, unique, considered to this landscape. And so the reaction to that is very negative. And then very positive too, and feeling, this is really good to be able to open this to discussion, and isn't it interesting what you see, how the world kind of transforms before our eyes. We're storytelling creatures, and this data is telling different kinds of stories.
So ideally, if people take this research seriously, what do you hope they might do? Just reconsider values of species, or reconsider the notion of who belongs where? Or
at the most sort of fundamental level, what I would like is generally for people to be aware that currently, when you look at data, even data that seems to be the most simple data that can data possibly be, such as counting things, that there is all sorts of pulsing magma made up of values and politics under it. That doesn't mean that the data is bad data, but it means looking at data with critical eyes. Not with dismissive eyes, but with thoughtful, critical eyes, just to start with. Then it would be a call to allow data that we consider to be so fundamental to the work of conservation science and everything that then comes out of that to be as transparent and inclusive as possible. If we want to have a database that only measures what's going on with populations inside the native range, then let's at least be very explicit that that's what we're doing and have that on the table very, very clearly. Because at the moment, if you click on the Iucn Red List, you just Google it and find the Iucn Red List, their homepage will say that what their goal is to be a complete barometer of life. Now, no one would argue that a camel in Australia is not life. Of course, they're life. So if you want to be a complete barometer of life, then you include everyone, warts and all, if you want to consider, whether you like it or not. You can also highlight it to saying, these have different histories if you want to include histories in there. But what I think it is, I think it is a mistake to just allow the data to sit there with so much of the Earth's biological diversity, so many different species, population, life forms, just wiped off the map. That, I think, is bad for science, and it's bad for democracy.
Interesting. Well, I ask everyone who comes on the program to answer 5 quick questions, but because you're a return guest, you've got 4 quick questions. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions? Okay, so for the people listening home, that was a nod.
Yes, sorry, yes.
So what's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting this research, or being an animal studies researcher, let's say?
I think it is so wonderful. Well, I find it so wonderful and mind opening to work across disciplines. I'm trained as an ecologist. I did my PhD in ecology. I did my undergraduate in biology. I had no formal training in the humanities, and when I finished my PhD, I was alarmed to discover that I actually don't know how to think very well. And by working in an interdisciplinary way, by bringing together people with different expertise and doing a project together, such as this, which in some case, in one respect, it's a science study. It's a science study. Well, let's just look at numbers and see how. Let's look at maps and percentages. And yet we're also asking fundamental questions about how values and politics are intertwined with data. And we can't, that's not something you can just do as an ecologist or a scientist. It's something that you have to do together in an interdisciplinary way. And so I don't even dare to say that I'm a animals studies scholar, but I love the fact that I'm having an opportunity to be a part of that conversation and be a part of collaborating with scholars that are working in this field.
Wonderful. Well, here's the flip side to that question. What's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of being an animal studies scholar or conducting this kind of research?
That is a hard one. I would just say that what I find disheartening is that that it is still difficult to cross disciplinary lines, and that there's a particular there's a particular prestige that comes with science, that there's a kind of pedestal that science is put on, which makes it more difficult, I think, for scientists such as myself to actually develop real open ways of thinking. Maybe even something that's kind of moving towards something like wisdom, right? We're kind of trying maybe to generate something like wisdom. And scientists on their own, we can't do that. And yet, if you're in a faculty of science, such as myself, I don't feel that there's a great deal of openness to scholars in the animal studies, or even an understanding of what it is that these scholars do, and that they have something real to offer. And so that's something that I find that is quite frustrating.
Yes, I bet. Interesting. Can you think of an animal studies scholar who you'd like to give a shout out to? So this is basically your opportunity to make listeners aware of someone who might be an emerging scholar, might be someone who is writing in a field that's been writing in the field for a while but hasn't received the recognition you think they deserve. They might be publishing in a language other than English. They might be working in an adjacent field, but you think it would be good for animal studies scholars to be aware of them. Who'd you like to give a shout out to?
Well, that is a difficult one, but I actually wanted to maybe go in the opposite direction and talk about a late scholar, Deborah Bird Rose, who passed away nearly a year ago now. And she acted for me as the first bridge to really widen my world. She worked a lot on dingoes. My background is, most of my research as an ecologist is on dingoes. Pretty much all of my thinking is on dingoes. We shared this love of a particular animal, and we came at our relationship with animals, with dingoes, was informed by our different fields, and so we joined together. And she was such an inspiring person. She was one of the first people in the humanities that I felt I could actually manage to understand her language, understand what she was saying. And she was such a generous and open person, and I miss her terribly. And I would, shout out to her, or howl out to her.
Yeah. I tried to get her on the podcast, but she was already unwell by the time I started it up, so we don't have her recorded in this context. But of course, she's written many, many things and is all what lives on in our thoughts. Final question. Are you optimistic about the future of human, non-human animal relationships?
Completely. Completely and utterly. I think we're going to be okay.
Oh, wonderful!
Yeah. I think we're going to be.
Realize.
Yeah, I think we're going to be okay. I think we're going through growing pains. I think there's a lot of things that I feel are just around the corner. Sometimes this sense of optimism gets shot down. Like 2016 was a bad year. But I feel very strongly that that we are a kind of new society, and we're growing up, and part of growing up is learning to have more a broader, wider, more generous moral world. And I think that's I think it's as inevitable as gravity.
Wow, we heard it here first. That's wonderful news. Thank you. So what are you working on next?
Well, I'm working on a few projects on dingoes, on wild donkeys, and I'm continuing to look at how our values inform how we understand general biodiversity trends. So I'm doing a lot of field work to actually see what is happening in these ecosystems, when humans manage not to manage them, and see what kind of what are these wild and wonderful creatures actually doing out there? What are the donkeys doing? What are the camels doing? How are the dingoes affecting everyone fundamentally? And then trying to see in a global sense what is actually happening in our world, and how is our understanding of the world informed by certain blind spots or certain preconceived ideas about what we value and don't value and why.
Wonderful. Well, how can people find out more about your work?
I guess in this case, our article in the Conversation is something that would be nice if for
I'll
people.
put a link to that
to
in
read.
the notes for the podcast episode.
Yeah, and then there are a few others that can be followed through. So that would be one place.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we talk to animal study scholars about their work. And you can also find us on the internet. We're on Twitter at knowing_animals, Facebook at Knowing Animals. We also have an Instagram feed. And finally, don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals. For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.